Welcome to Explorations. Today we're talking to Paul Costello, the founder and director of Storywise.com and the Center for Narrative Studies. Since 1995, Paul has been researching new ways to unleash the power of story and apply it to some of the most challenging issues of our time. In this first of a five-part interview, Paul shares how his early work with Catholic and Protestant students from Northern Ireland and Ireland led to profound insights in how to work with the power of story to create transformative change. So let's get to it. Paul, it's really great to have you here on Explorations. We've had already a number of conversations in the past year about the power of story, and I'm so looking forward to one, hearing about your history with story and your evolving perspective about the power of story. So welcome.
Wonderful to see you. Wonderful to see you.
It's just great to have you on here. And I just feel like the work you've been doing has just been pioneering in many regards. Tell me early on, I know that early on you got a phone call from a colleague. She had a project going with students from Northern Ireland, Catholic and Protestant students, that was not going well. And she said, Paul, maybe you've got some ideas. Tell us about that project, and that became sort of the seed project for a lot of your work.
Yeah, so like I was lucky enough a long time ago to have a sabbatical from Australia, where I'm from, to come to Washington and do postgraduate research in the power of stories that was emerging then in therapy. That's where I first came across it, narrative therapy, and the work of Michael White, who was a mentor and colleague from Adelaide, Australia. And so I got all excited to link with my research to set up a training institute called the Center for Narrative Studies, or Storywise. And I recruited some of my university friends to be part of that. And then that's the lady, Kathy, who's a dear, dear friend, just said, like, we have these Catholic and Protestant young men and women who come out here for 4 weeks for summer in Washington, D.C. And we're using the mediation methods of Anacostia, which are pretty blunt and pretty brutal. And these young folks are just in revolt. They just are not, I think they were told, like, Catholics go in that corner and Protestants go in that corner. And it's like, wow. So like it was a crisis. And Kathy said, Paul, we should use stories to be a new way of creating a different sort of conversation between these embattled groups from Northern Ireland, Belfast, Derry, and so on. So that began in like 1997, 1998, a chance for us to build out a narrative program from the beginning. And then, like, we had webmasters building blogging sites before there was blogs. And so we had a lot of fun. We built a narrative program, which is still running today, called the Washington Island Program. So that's how that allowed us to do it was like a live experiment about all the stuff we were learning and researching. Could we apply it to a practical peace and leadership program that was so needed in Northern Ireland? And this is just around the time of the Good Friday Agreement.
Yeah, and one of the things you told me was these young people were coming here. I mean, one of the reasons that it became invaluable to do the work in Washington was if we tried to go back and do it there in the pubs every night, the story of Bloody Sunday was being retold as though it happened yesterday. The metaphor I use is it's like cucumbers pickling in brine. They were pickling in this story environment that would have made it very hard for them to make a leap beyond that. Say a little more about that.
Well, I mean, my father, I'm second generation Irish, third generation Irish Australian. My father's father was Irish. The Irish have a great knack of telling stories, and they have a certain propensity about dwelling in a past, and there hasn't been a very happy past, I guess. But it's a cynical kind of comment, but they're never happy unless they're miserable. And I think even the Irish would probably understand that sort of mentality. But, you'd be staying in Belfast. And I remember always telling the story of overhearing a conversation in the Wellington Park Hotel in Belfast one night and thinking it sounded very dramatic, and it sounded horrible, and it sounded tragic and violent. And I pricked up my ears trying to work out what was going on. Was there another bombing? Was there another terrorist attack in Belfast or something? Until I suddenly realized that they were telling a story about 1921 and Michael Collins. It was about the Irish Civil War of 80 years ago, but told so vividly that it was enough to distract me from my conversation, which means that somehow stories keep some experiences alive, or actually they add to some experiences. And so I guess that's what the narrative approach in Ireland and Northern Ireland was, to say, what's the news story? How can we create a news story? Given that in Northern Ireland, it's a separate school system, there's a wall down the center of Belfast. They call it a peace wall, but actually it's to stop the war, stop them throwing Molotov cocktails over the barbed wire walls and so on. So it's like, what's the theory of change by which we could spark a new story of possibility rather than a story of the problem? And our weapon was really Washington and summer and young people, and giving them the best internships we could, giving them the best experiences we could, so that as young people in Washington in the summer, they somehow could have a shared experience that they wouldn't be possible for them to have back in their home region. And then to build, that's like, it's like the prologue. It didn't achieve anything in and of itself, but that would be the prologue to the possibility that this could create a different story, an alternative story to the one that they grew up with.
You shared with me in our earlier conversation is that part of what you wanted the young students to discover was that they had a voice and that they had a story that was
Right.
their story.
Right. I mean, Americans, we all are familiar with intern programs, and, people, aspiring leaders, want to go and intern at a congressional office and stuff like that. So that's what we would be offering them. We had our young people in the White House and in, working with the vice president. That was pretty heady stuff, pretty amazing stuff. But it's those kinds of things often, we went to the British embassy, and the British ambassador comes out and tells us about the situation in Derry, because there were tanks and there was trouble, the marching season. And if you've been to the British embassy in Washington, there's a Shakespearean theater there. So the ambassador's on the stage and our interns are in the audience, right? And some of them are, pretty amazing young people, but some of them are fiery Irish. So the ambassador comes out and he very, so the situation in Londonderry is very, very, very hopeful. Like he's Oxford, Cambridge or whatever. And I'm sitting behind one of my Irish lads, he's 22, 23, Sean, and I could just see him shoulders, and I'm thinking like, don't, Sean, don't, just please calm down. But I couldn't stop him. And Sean jumps to his feet and just says to the ambassador, Mr. Ambassador, with all respect, that's bullshit. My sister went to school this morning and she went through tanks and guns and checkpoints, and you're telling us that it's all peaceful in Derry? So the ambassador sort of huffed and puffed and said, well, and then immediately an advisor tapped him on the shoulder and said, oh, you've got to, I'm so sorry. And he exited stage left. He couldn't get off that stage quick enough. And it's like, the lesson for me was like, I will never let that happen again, meaning that from then on, anytime we have a so-called expert on the stage talking to my students, my interns, they're the experts too. There will always be one of them or two of them on the stage with any expert. If it was President Obama, Hillary Clinton, I don't care. It's their story. So part of this work is honoring people to say, because I think a lot of the oppression happens when people steal other people's stories. Like, what the hell does a British ambassador, like, it's not his story. It's the people from Derry's story to tell as authentic witnesses. They live that life. And so authority can somehow come in and steal the voice and claim the story, which is not fair. It's not democratic. So I just think that was one of the principles where from then on, we built a program where the Americans in Washington needed to hear a Catholic story and a Protestant story of young people aspiring to a shared future, but being honest, dealing honestly with their struggles and their challenges. So that was, that became a principle of all the work we did then. From then on, Ireland, South Africa, Israel, Palestine, whose story is it and who's telling it to whom? That's a power dynamic. And I think as storytellers, often we don't put power and story in the same equation, but you kind of have to if you're serious about change.
Sam Keen, who's written a lot on myth and story, he says the word author and the word authority have a lot in common.
Right.
And so whoever authors our story has authority or power, as you're describing it. And so what I'm hearing is that it was your empowering or helping them become fully step into their authorship
Right.
of their life experience.
Right. And I think it's a practical application of what we call a narrative ethics, and it's also a sign of resistance. I always quote Barbara Meyerhoff, the famous Jewish American anthropologist in Florida, that Michael White loved to quote. And she has a saying which she says, the first step of liberation of an oppressed people is to grab back their story. And it's like, stop telling, it's like men tell women's stories and whites tell black people's stories and, straight people tell gay people's stories. It's just like the minority, the people underneath that have to kind of step up and say, hey, that's my story. I want to tell it, and I want to tell it in my way and in my time. And even if it doesn't make sense to you, it's important that it makes sense to me. So I think that was. Now, sometimes, of course, I remember another sort of story with the Israel-Palestine one. It was 2014. It was one of the most. I mean, we had a program, Israel-Palestine, while the Gaza war was on, and I had young people from Gaza in my program. So they would be calling every day to see if their family was still alive. And my Israeli young people would be calling every day to their friends who were flying bombing raids over Gaza to see if they were still alive or how they were doing. And I remember one of the final acts was, the members got up and gave speeches, but one of the Palestinian young people wanted to get up and just, he was from Bethlehem. And, he got up and he was ready to sort of speak an absolute tirade against Israel based upon what was happening in Gaza. And I remember having this, trying to say, you talk about Bethlehem, you talk about being a refugee. You're not from, you can say you're Palestinian, but you don't live in Gaza. You're not from Gaza. There's another person from Gaza. That's her story. And she got up and, she caused some controversy, because she was obviously, her country's being bombed, people are being killed. So she was really raging. But you know what? I just kind of thought, I learned a lot. It's like, that's her story and she can tell it because it's her story. But you're a refugee. You can tell a story. If you want to link the story of Gaza war to your experience as a refugee, go for it. That's your authentic story. But don't, honor the witness whose story it is. Don't appropriate somebody else's voice or somebody else's experience. And I think to myself, we do that all the time. I mean, I do it. We all do it. We present ourselves as authentic witnesses for something that we're totally on the outside of.